Hello and welcome to our next episode of the Exponential Australia Church Leaders Podcast. We are delighted that you have joined us today as we jump into all range of subjects and conversations, particularly when it comes to an increase in multiplication in our nation here in Australia, and of course being well aware of what is happening all around the earth. And today we are joined by a new friend of mine whose name is David. And he has become firstly a new friend, but obviously as one who brings a wide range of expertise, particularly when it comes to talking about migration, when it comes to talking about the changing landscape of the church in Australia. And of course, we celebrate the fact that the parts of the church in our nation that are flourishing and growing and are seeing levels of exponential reproduction and growth are parts of the migrant church here in Australia. And I know it is a very ongoing conversation in a lot of denominations, a lot of churches around how we can both partner with, encourage, and actually be more mindful of some of the dynamics of shift and change that are happening in our nation. And so, David, first and foremost, it's an absolute joy and a blessing to have you on the podcast with us today. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Charlie. Oh, it's great to be here. I've been looking forward to this, Charlie, and thanks for the invitation.
Oh, it's great. Well, David, as with all of our guests, we love just to get to know them a little bit better, hear a little bit about their lives, their families, where they're based, the ministries they're involved with, but also just give us a bit of a thumbnail sketch as to some of the experiences that you have had as you've been serving the Lord and all the different things that you've been involved with.
Thank you, Charlie. So I'm we've lived in, my family and I, we've lived in Melbourne for the last 8 years. I'm actually a second generation British-born Chinese. I was born in London to Hong Kong and Malaysian parents, and my wife is actually a fifth generation Australian-born Chinese. She was born in Sydney.
Wow.
But we've always kind of been wrestling in that on that front, even in our upbringing, with at least one or two other cultures. But in our ministries over the years, we've been involved in church planting and pastoral ministry in immigrant churches, in multi-ethnic churches, and even in predominantly Anglo churches. But it's all those roles have always involved something about crossing cultures or being in between cultures or the intercultural spaces in all of those roles. And that's kind of just who we are. And our kids are now officially adults, and they've lived in 5 continents as well. So we've lived in the UK, the USA, and Australia, but we've also lived in South Africa and also in Asia. And so, I, at the moment, in terms of my own ministry, I spend actually most of my time working outside of Australia with the majority world in theological colleges and leadership development for leaders in those places. But I'm also trying to start up this new initiative that intersects the local and the global, which is with diaspora communities that you've talked about, that we'll maybe touch on a bit later on. So I'm just trying to think of the local and the global here in Australia, how we connect those two, and that's really a lot of it is with diaspora or immigrant church communities. And so I think all those experiences, Charlie, have kind of is how the Lord has shaped me, in these intercultural spaces, and how I think He's kind of led me to serve even as I'm here in Australia now. So that's a potted summary. Yeah,
that's great, David. I appreciate you doing that for us today, and I think it's just a very timely conversation that we're having today. I mean, it's been a theme growing within the church in Australia for some time. I've just returned from the Exponential Global Conference, where it feels like at least the conversation is far more advanced when it comes to multi-ethnic church planting and just being far more aware of some of the dynamics at play. And you serve on the executive leadership team of the Lausanne Global Diaspora Network. And I guess particularly as you've had all the experiences that you've had, as you've found yourself in 5 different continents and you work with the majority world, What are some of the patterns that you are noticing globally that help us to, I guess, really interpret what's happening here in Australia? Of course, it's no secret to anyone that Australia is a very multicultural nation, has been highly influenced by migration. You would be observing some things that have probably been felt in other parts of the world for some time, and that I think particularly for us as church leaders, we're still coming to terms with and really thinking deeply about here in Australia.
Yeah, no, totally. I think, some of those trends and patterns that you talk about, Charlie, I think probably one of the ones, one that a lot of people have heard about has been what people have called the shift in the center of gravity of Christianity. So one of them, all that means is that essentially most of the world's Christians now, actually about 2/3 of the world's Christians now live outside of the West. So only 1/3 of the world's Christians are now in America, Europe, and Australia. And so what that means is that the typical Christian in the world now is no longer an Anglo, Westerner. Yes. It's probably like an African or an Asian globally. So just 2/3 of the world's Christians, and that's different from, say, 70 to 100 years ago, where there was the complete reverse. Your typical Christian would be an Anglo-Westerner, and in America, Europe, or in Australia. So a lot of people have said that's a pattern that's changed things. That now most of the world's Christians are now outside of the West. And typically people are starting to talk about a bit of a decline, a numerical decline in some of the, traditional denominations in the West. And so that's one sort of pattern that people are seeing. But from the purposes of migration and diaspora communities and immigration, one of the important things to note is that people are on the move. It's not that people are just there are just people, Christians numerically growing in those countries over there, but even in the West, we're getting the people are on the move, and so scholars have talked about the age in which we're living in now, Charlie, as being the age of migration. Wow. And so what they mean by that is that they're saying that more than any previous generation or age before us, people have been on the move more than they ever have been before. And so what we're seeing is that whether that's, in other countries, with the massive internal migration that happens in continents like Africa and Asia, but that's having a huge impact in terms of the opportunities for mission. But even in Western countries like Europe and America and Australia, even, it's impacting us in a way that where we're seeing greater migration, and therefore that's actually changing not only the general landscape, but actually also the Christian landscape, and that we're getting more Christians from other places coming to Australia. And so because we're living in this age of migration, that's another massive pattern that's actually impacting the Christian landscape. And so we're seeing now that the number of churches that are growing some people say that the immigrant churches are the ones that are really growing in these Western countries more than other churches. And so, for example, in London, talking about other places, in London, the biggest churches there are now African. And in Australia, I've had a number of denominational leaders say to me that were it not for the immigrant churches that have just so happened to join their denominations, the culturally and linguistically diverse, congregations, they would be actually in decline. And numerically, they'd be in decline. And so we're looking at these immigrant churches who are planting churches here in Australia. And there's Africans, there are Arabic-speaking churches, there are Asian churches. But and yet that are halting the numerical decline of a lot of denominations, and yet it's thinking about how do we see each other as the one body of Christ together in this Christian landscape. And I think that one of the discussions that's been happening in the West is this kind of fear over secularization and how the West is secularizing the world. A lot of Christians are concerned about that. But one of the important things, just from what I've just said, that's really and it should be an encouragement to us, I think, is that actually immigrant churches are actually halting some of that discussion on secularization, because they are kind of growing. And so it's a question of kind of actually seeing each other. How can we together as the body of Christ serve, Australia and make an impact within Australia as part of the church and the changing Christian landscape. So I'd see a couple of those as being those two as being some of the patterns that we're kind of observing, especially as we're thinking about Australia and Western countries.
Yes. Yeah, very significant, and that is not a uncommon story that I've heard as I connect with church leaders and denominational leaders, that that some of the really exciting growth and multiplication that is happening in the Australian church is happening through migrant communities. I mean, I think there's an ongoing conversation as to what does multi-ethnic ministry look like compared to mono-ethnic ministry as well. I think. And you would know this better than anyone, David, even some of the tensions that may be being felt in some of our churches around second generation and kind of, what does it mean for those who have been raised in certain communities and the way that they are part of either that existing church or planting new churches that are mindful of some of those, cultural dynamics. Before we go anywhere else, is there anything that you would want to say about that? And I guess some of the tension that then emerges for some of these communities that have, come to Australia and doing wonderful things and leading amazing churches, but just some of the tension that can be felt there.
Yeah, I think because, one of the US kind of immigrant churches have been kind of reflecting on some of this for a long time. And one of the projects that I've been involved in recently, we were reflecting on some of these questions. But typically when we're dealing with first generation who come, and obviously there are certain ways of doing things culturally that are very similar to the way they did things back in the homeland, right? And when they come to say US or Australia, that those migrant communities maybe continue on in that kind of cultural form of church and their way of teaching and their way of relating even to their children, the second generation. But then the second generation obviously are trying to fit into Australia, but they're also trying to fit in to their first generation. And sometimes some of those tensions, can be, significant in the church, where there may be a reluctance to allow maybe the second generation to move forward in different ways of doing ministry. And so there are still cultural tensions, even though because there are these what we call intergenerational tensions. And one of the difficulties, one of the challenges of a lot of migrant churches is that the second generation leave the migrant churches, and they try to either plant on their own, and they either try to there's division in the church as a result, and they multiply. They multiply, but they're multiplying through division, and so there are some health issues, right? And so, there are all sorts of, tensions that I could go on, but I know I've got limited time, Charlie. But, one common phenomenon is that, the second generation leaving. And the Americans, have called that phenomenon the silent exodus, where people, the second generation, silently leave the immigrant churches. And that has tended to be, a very real phenomenon in the US, and we've seen this in Australia as well. But the interesting thing is, Charlie, is that in the US, what they found is that sometimes later on in life, some of those that had left come back to the immigrant churches. Because, as they raise their children, as they want to think cross-culturally and reprocess their own cultural identity in the light of the gospel, they sometimes return back to the immigrant churches. They don't just go into multi-ethnic churches, or some do, but they don't just go into those multi-ethnic spaces. They want to revisit that and maybe reprocess that in light of their own cultural identity. And so it's an interesting thing, and every place is different. But yeah, those are just some of the tensions that happen in immigrant churches.
It's great. And I'm sure towards the end of our conversation, I'm sure for those who are having their appetite whet from some of the kind of insights that you're offering, I'm sure you can point us in the right direction. But before we kind of begin to head in that direction, I was particularly interested, as you teach and research, particularly around global migration and urban mission, particularly from the lens of multiplication and obviously Exponential wanting to cheer on all forms of multiplication and church planting, being model neutral, being theologically neutral. What are some of the opportunities that you think this diaspora or this kind of conversation around migrant church planting exists for multiplication here in Australia? What are some of the things that we might be missing, particularly for, potentially those who have led in the church for some time, have maybe had a prevailing approach that seeks to reach those that would be Anglo in origin, or predominantly thinking about that being the people group that they are being aware of or ministering to, all those kind of factors. What might the average church or church leader be missing, David?
I think, Charlie, for that, and as I think about multiplication, especially through things like church planting and revitalization, there are definitely opportunities for partnership and in those areas. But as I was thinking about your question, and I was thinking about what the church might be missing, the thing that really stood out to me is almost like we have to, I think, go a couple of steps back and think about just as I was saying earlier, if immigrant churches are growing here in Australia, they're going to be part of our current Christian landscape, and they're currently shaping our Christian landscape, but also not just in the present, but in the future. Are we missing out on first of all, the opportunity to build relationship and actually even learn from one another about as we think about church planting and revitalization? So do we actually even know any pastors who are from immigrant churches and their backgrounds? Do we know what some of the issues they're facing are for church planting and revitalization? Are they different to what the Anglo-Australian churches are going through? So that if we were to think about resourcing, that's not necessarily like a one-size-fits-all program, but where we're actually prayerfully and in relationship, and so I've seen the reason why I mentioned that, Charlie, is because I think that I've seen a number of cases, not just here in Australia but overseas, where as say like British churches or American churches have tried to get to know immigrant churches, there has been a real mutual blessing in that. So sometimes when you see immigrant churches, and they've maybe got a lot to teach Anglo churches about prayer or what it means to live in as a religious minority overseas, but they know what that's like, and so they bring that over here. Whereas the Anglo church could also, bless them in other ways as well. And so, but that relationship, I think, is always, the key starting point. That, we as the body of Christ, as Christians now in Australia, would do well to basically have relationship with a view to growing gospel unity, growing gospel partnership in those areas. But first we have to understand what are the challenges we're wrestling with, right? And I always think that it's a real shame, Charlie, that if we miss out on that, because there's a lot to learn with, from the experience they've brought as the global church coming into Australia, and what we can learn from them. And so we don't actually have to go overseas to get that cross-cultural experience. It could be the pastor that's either meeting in our building, or it could be a pastor in our suburb or neighboring suburb, or it could be anyone, but it's, and then just trying to help those churches or denominations increase their vision of what the church is in Australia. And, I would say even things like our conferences, who we get to speak to, raise that awareness of, and those relationships will outflow into those, that understanding of the broader church in Australia, the growing church in Australia. So I think that, I think there are loads of opportunities for, partnership and those things. But I really, you could think that the relationship aspect is so important, for us to begin almost there before we even talk about multiplication. It's actually understanding the challenges of multiplication. What are pastors going through as they think about multiplying? What's going on behind the divisions, in the multiplication through divisions? What are those issues, and how do we even begin to understand? And I think that comes through relationship. That would be I think a tragedy if we missed out on.
Yeah, it's so true, David. And I'm aware that there's a leader associated with Exponential in the US that often talks about that. What precedes the Great Commission is the Great Collaboration, and we actually need to be friends on mission together as we develop that relationship and that trust, even with those that we may not necessarily theologically be on the same page with or have different approaches to doing things. And I think definitely when it comes to culturally, we just recognize, I guess, the beauty and diversity of the way that the Lord wants to use his whole bride, not just certain parts of the bride. And I guess this is a wonderful segue into, I guess, an initiative that you're working on currently. You're kind of, obviously, this is a specialty of yours, and you're developing an initiative for migrant church pastors. I wonder if you could, share with our listeners today what that is, what that looks like, how people may choose to engage with that. Give us a bit of an introduction into what you're working on.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. So, the initiative is called the Thriving Immigrant Church Initiative, so TICI for short. And it was actually an initiative that I was invited to participate in the US. So one of my previous professors, Dr. Peter Cha, started the one in the US. So there's a TICI, a Thriving Immigrant Church Initiative in the US that's been going for 4 years now. And so I participated in the second cohort, and then we were basically in prayer about this and thinking about whether we should launch something similar in Australia. And we had a kind of public gathering at Sydney Missionary Bible College last November. He came over with Pastor Paul Kim, whose church in Virginia we use as a kind of model immigrant church, and that is both thriving spiritually but also missionally beyond its own ethnic boundary. And so so we've decided to explore that for Australia. And so we have a website. It's just come out. It's ticiaustralia.org, ticiaustralia.org. And people can understand that. And the essence of the program is that, we've talked about some of the challenges of immigrant churches. And two of their major challenges have always been focused around having healthy relationships between the first and second generation, some of those cultural dynamics you were talking about, Charlie.
Yes.
And some of that tension that leads to sometimes a second generation leaving. So healthy intergenerational relationships is one major issue. And the second major issue is how these immigrant churches, whether they're Korean, African, Chinese, whatever they may be, how they can make a gospel impact beyond their own ethnic boundaries. And so those are the two main kind of issues that TICI tries to address. And the way that we're trying to address it, in the US, we did it as a 2-year learning journey. So essentially, we'd invite about 6 or 7 of a church's key leaders. So all the pastors have to be involved, and they'll choose also some key leaders, maybe a youth leader, There has to be a woman involved there, as well as maybe all the pastors from each generation. And they all have to be involved in this team they bring to TICI. And what we do is basically we take them through, two-day gatherings per year, over 2 years. And we basically keep them accountable throughout that learning journey. So to make changes, actual changes in their churches in those two main areas. And so by the end of those 2 years, hopefully they would have made some progress. And then after the 2 years, when they finish, we will set up a network, an alumni network of immigrant churches, where we can continue the conversation. And so that if things like church planting and other things are talked about, at least we can do it from the standpoint of, thriving immigrant churches, planting other thriving immigrant churches,
yes,
and still being missional beyond their ethnic boundaries, So I think that's basically the vision. And in Australia, we're thinking about possibly either launching it this year or next year, depending on the churches. And we're thinking of shortening maybe the learning journey. So we've still got some adjustments to be made, but people can look on the website and learn more about TICI Australia. So, and I think maybe the key thing to note about TICI is that we're targeting different immigrant churches. So it's, from different backgrounds. So they could be African, Islander, Indian, Chinese, whatever they may be. So it's a diverse learning community. Yes. And it's interdenominational. Really, we're just trying to create space to be able to get alongside these pastors and leaders in order to help their churches to thrive in Australia. So,
it's brilliant. I love that initiative, and we, from an exponential perspective, absolutely throw our endorsement and excitement behind that. And so if you missed it, it's ticiaustralia.org. And I think it's, as we've already talked about, it's the very real reality of church ministry here in Australia is the multicultural aspect of all that the Lord is doing and growing through the church here in Australia. So it is something that is on our doorstep and should be considered and thought deeply about. And so we're so glad that you'll be able to join us for that fact alone. But I guess the final question that I want to ask David with our time together is particularly around, we've heard some of the dynamics at play. We've heard about TICI. I'd particularly love to ask a question both for denominational leaders, potentially resource churches that are really considering, maybe they haven't entered into the migrant church planting space, or they haven't thought deeply about some of the dynamics of culture. And I guess this is a great way to point people in a direction by way of follow-up from our conversation is, what are some of the urgent or proactive things that people could do, particularly in continuing this conversation, in wanting to kind of be aware of some of the dynamics of play that we've discussed, and what would you want to cheer on or encourage church leaders to do following on from our conversation today?
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. That's a great question. I think that in terms of denominations and, key resource churches, I think one, some very basic kind of starter questions would be just things like, do we have, as we think about denominational strategy for the next 10, 20 years, or however we plan our future strategy, does that strategy include immigrant churches in any way? And are we finding ways to reflect on, given that a lot of our denominations are becoming more multi-ethnic, and that some of the growing sectors of within our denominations are through immigrant churches, is there a strategy in place to be able to think about how we can resource and make sure that pastors are got alongside and supported, as well as as part of the broader church. And it goes back to saying, along with those patterns that we were talking about, if essentially the immigrant church is here to stay and shaping the current and future landscape of Christianity, how can we better as denominations think about a strategy And so as we think about, I guess the first question would be, does our current strategy include the immigrant church? And are we investing resources, into that as well as into the wider church? And I think probably going along with that, it's strategies, but along with that often comes structures and spaces. Sometimes we have to facilitate those strategies. We need new structures, and we need maybe leaders who are experienced in these areas to help us, facilitate and think and be a voice in the room to champion and make sure that we don't forget the voices of immigrant church leaders that are forming such a significant part of our denomination. And so who do we put in those positions? Do we have the structure to support those strategies, and are we creating spaces? And that's basically what TICI is. It's trying to, create spaces because we hope that more conferences and more Bible colleges and more denominations would be doing this kind of thing more. And TICI welcomes that kind of partnership with denominations as well. But it's really thinking about that kind of strategy and the sort of structural elements and spaces that we have to invest. And I think that that would be, I think, a really important aspect, so that as we're presenting, what we're, for the future of mission and the future of the church in Australia and our commitments, that we're including the immigrant church in that discussion and in that resourcing, whether it be church planting, leadership development, whatever it might be. And so, so that's one of some basic questions I would probably, mention for those kind of denominational leaders and key resource churches.
It's brilliant. David, there's no doubt that the East has definitely started to impact and affect the West. And of course, the church in the developing world is flourishing and growing. And as to your comments that we are in an age of migration, the church in Australia is only going to be better because of this conversation, because of the fact that we are being intentional about it rather than unintentional. And from the bottom of our heart, we just really thank you for championing this conversation. Thank you for being with us today. It's been an absolute joy to have you on the podcast.
Oh, you too, Charlie. Thanks so much again for the invitation. And look forward to further conversations.